Well, hello there, I'm Poppa Jon, and welcome to the first episode of Heroes in Horror. Now, I'm passionate about comic book movies, but I also love nothing more than to explore and analyze horror films. So why not combine them both here each week, hopefully. There might be a couple weeks here missed due to personal reasons, but for the most part, each week I will pick a comic book movie topic to talk about and a horror film topic to talk about. And so today, for the comic book movies, is going to be the main focus of episode 1, which is going to be the year in 2024 of comic book movies, which is, we'll get into it. And then for the horror section, we will be talking about Nosferatu and Robert Eggers in general, as well as some Dracula discussion. And so, without further ado, let's get started. And the first topic here that we are going to discuss is the Spider-Man Sony-verse without a Spider-Man that we got going here. It's called like the SSU. I don't know why they call it that. It's a stupid name. So, we got Madam Web, Kraven the Hunter, and Venom the Last Dance. Now, I talk about these movies in a video from last month where I kind of ranked the Sony-verse here. And I'm a defender of Morbius. That is one thing I will take to my grave that nobody agrees with me on, is I like Morbius. That being said, I also like Venom the Last Dance. A lot of people give it a lot of hate, and I'll never sit here and tell you it's a perfect movie. There are definitely issues here, especially when they're in Vegas. But I genuinely do think this is the best film in this universe. By a decent margin, for as much as I love Morbius, I just think I love the bromance here between Venom. I think it's the best bromance out of all three of the Venom movies between Venom and Eddie is in this one. I get a lot of fun out of the hippie characters. I know a lot of people have issues with them. The third act is really good. Is the best CGI nonsense out of all of the Venom movies. I genuinely dug what they were going for. Did they pull it off 100%? No. But given what this universe has to offer, it's the best. That being said, that can't be said for the other two. I was very forgiving, I think, initially when I first saw Kraven, but it has not sat well with me at all. I do get a lot of schlocky fun out of Kraven, but it's not good. The I'm a hunter line didn't bother me as much as it bothered some other people, but the thing that bothered the hell out of me more than anything in any of these movies in this entire universe is the Russell Crowe character and his dialogue of just every single line. It's fear makes you weak, and you can't be weak. I hated it. I hated it so much. I hated that character so much. I do get a lot of schlocky fun out of it, though. And that means that Madam Web, I think, is the worst of the worst. I think it epitomizes everything that's wrong with this universe. Just the whole, it's a prequel to Spider-Man's prequel. And it's an origin of 5 characters that comic book fans hardly even know about. And there's no audience for it. I like seeing Ben from Parks and Rec as Uncle Ben. I get a kick out of that. I get fun out of the jokes around Mrs. Parker, what they're going to name the baby. I get a lot of weird fun out of that, but I like a little bit of the throwback 2000s aspect of this movie. But if I want that, I'm going to throw on Morbius or Bloodshot. I'm not going to throw on Madam Web. It's everything that everyone complains about in all of these movies. Madam Web is the worst offender of, in my opinion. And, I mean, I don't want to go on too much about it. I have another video where I talk about this universe and franchise more in depth. So you can go ahead and check that out. But to transition, it's kind of a bad transition that I messed the fuck up. But to transition, for as bad as Madam Web is, I don't think it is one of the worst comic book movies ever made. And I think if you think it's one of the worst, if it's the worst comic book movie you've ever seen, I'm okay with that. But saying it's one of the worst comic book movies ever made is a different statement, in my opinion. And I got a shit list for you if you think one of the worst comic book movies ever made came out this year. So just keep that in mind. But I don't think Madam Web was the worst of the year. I don't think Kraven was the worst of the year. The worst comic book movie of the year, and I'll get into why, was The Crow. I could not stand this fucking movie. I will say this. If you are looking at a pure, objective, just technical quality, it is better made and more slickly made than Madam Web, which is a lot more thrown together with ADR and everything than The Crow is. But I think The Crow is more offensive than Madam Web. And that's where my issue lies here is it's not just bad, it's offensive. Madam Web is just a bad idea that became a bad movie. The Crow is an offensive movie that is also a bad movie. You know, you can go into the whole Brandon Lee, Eric Draven stuff that a lot of people have gone into, and that's a valid argument. That's not necessarily my main issue that I find offensive about it, because I didn't grow up with the original The Crow, which is a much better movie, like by far. But I didn't grow up with it, so I don't have that same connection to it. I think my biggest issue is that I just find offensive is how boring it is. Madam Web isn't boring. It's bad, but it's not boringly bad. The Crow is boringly bad, and the fact that it, in a sense, should be tailor-made for me. Because I didn't grow up with the original The Crow, but I am a part of that target audience that would love a movie like that for a modern day. If they went at it at that approach, I would have loved it. And I think my biggest issue is, when I watched this movie, and I might be the only person that got this out of this movie, but it was the design of Bill Skarsgård's character. I was sitting there watching this movie, and I'm like, this is some 50-year-old man's version of what a SoundCloud rapper from 7 years ago looks like. What the fuck is happening here? Why? It's like someone showed a 50-year-old man a picture of Lil Peep and said, make this emo kid into a superhero. And this is what he came up with. Someone that doesn't even know who it is. He's just shown a picture of him and said he's a popular emo rapper from the SoundCloud era. Make him into a superhero. It's like, what the fuck is this? And the first part of this movie just plays out like someone who's out of touch with that audience is making an origin story for a SoundCloud rapper. Because, like, it's not just the look of him. It's like the story itself is like these two people who like music come together, and then you get the whole part where she's singing and everything. And it's just weird. I don't know why my brain makes that connection, but it did. I mean, I can understand why, because, you know, they're over there playing a music thing in that one scene. And for whatever reason, that's the connection my brain had. And I was just like, this guy's out of touch with this audience. Like, it just seemed like someone who's painfully decades out of touch with the audience that they're making a movie for. And that's why I found it so offensive. And then in terms of people that are fans of the original The Crow, obviously you're going to find it offensive for some other reasons with Eric Draven and the Brandon Lee controversy and all of that. So I understand that as well. So this movie, from no end, really has anything. It's more slickly made, I guess, on a technical level. I might say it's better than Madam Web. But to me, it's the worst comic book movie of 2024. That's The Crow. For as bad as Madam Web is and Kraven is, it's The Crow. That's the worst of 2024. Now moving on to another comic book movie that was not a part of one of the big two companies that released this year, and that being Hellboy, the Crooked Man. This was a VOD release. I don't believe it got a theatrical release. I could be wrong. But, you know, I think it's a pretty decent made. I know a lot of people are putting it at the bottom, and there's a lot of people that aren't. I think it's a pretty decently made direct-to-video Hellboy movie, you know. It's not Guillermo del Toro, obviously. It's not the best Hellboy movie. But when you compare it to other movies that released this year, it's not half bad. It's not half bad. And I know a lot of people have said this, and I'm going to say the same thing. This is a really good episode of television. Like a really good pilot, I would say. I've heard people say it's a good episode 7 and 8. I think it's a good pilot because while it's not necessarily an origin, it has hints of stories in there that you can pick at later on in episodes to unpack his origin. And this is just a good little story that I think works really well. Because the vibes I got from this, it gave me the same vibes as the Constantine TV show and the same vibes as as the Preacher show. Both are shows that I genuinely love. So I get a lot of fun out of that. It gives me the same vibe as a couple TV shows that I think are underrated and underappreciated within the comic book TV genre. It's not one that I'm going to revisit a whole lot, but I think it's definitely worth your attention. Crooked Man's creepy. You get some creepy sequences in there. You're not going to get the best special effects. The CGI spider thing isn't very good. But, it's direct-to-video, VOD release. You're not getting a big blockbuster budget here. You go in expecting that, and I don't think you'll get that big of a disappointment out of it, if any disappointment at all. I think, for the most part, it works pretty damn well. Now, sticking to VOD releases and moving on to DC, we have Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths. All 3 parts came out in 2024, and I think the first part 1, is definitely the best out of the 3. I did enjoy it overall. I haven't kept up with the Tomorrowverse in the same way I did with the DeCamu last decade, so I don't have as big of a connection with it. I am a big fan of Superman, Man of Tomorrow. I know that one for a fact I'm a big fan of. But overall, this Tomorrowverse, I haven't kept up with it in the same light. But I enjoyed, especially the part 1. I enjoyed part 1 quite a bit. The animation style I'm not the biggest fan of. But part 1 tells a good, tragic story with the Flash and Iris West that at first, it felt a little jumbled, like where are we going with how they're structuring the story. But it all comes together at the end, and I do think part 1, for that reason, is by far the best part. Part 2, I think, is by far the weakest. With part 2, I think, individually, I like what they were doing with Supergirl's character and what they were doing with the Psycho Pirate. I actually really loved what they were doing with the Psycho Pirate, but it felt a little too disconnected. And it does kind of come together at the end, but part 2 really did just feel like one of those to get us from point A to point B. This had to happen. And part 3 I thought was really well done. For the most part, I don't think it was on the highs of part 1. And even part 1 I don't think is up there necessarily as the best of the year. But I do think overall, the 3 parts put together, it's not Justice League Dark Apocalypse War, but it's good, it's fine. It does a decent, faithful job of telling Crisis on Infinite Earths. And I don't have much to complain about it. It's just, it's not one of the best animated DC movies out there, but it's not one of the worst. And moving on to Watchmen, Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. If you don't know this, I am a big fan of Watchmen, the movie by Zack Snyder. I have a whole story with that where I was begging my parents to let me see this movie. Because I had a mom that was very strict when it came to the rating systems. And mainly just rated R, not necessarily strict when it came to PG-13. But when it came to rated R movies, she was fairly strict. My dad always had to watch them before I was allowed to watch them. And because there's a certain sex scene, I was not allowed to watch Watchmen. But for my dad to check it out, they did rent it from Family Video. And so I was able to sneak it away before they returned it. After they told me, no, you can't watch it, I was able to sneak it away before they returned it, and I watched it on a little portable DVD player that I had in my room. And ever since then, it's been one of my favorite movies So, still is one of my favorite comic book movies. I love Watchmen, the book, the story. Yes, I was introduced to it through the movie, not the book, but the book's amazing. The story's amazing. The HBO show is amazing. Tales of the Black Freighter's great. The ultimate cut, the director's cut. Even I love the theatrical cut. And I was curious how they were going to do this, and I loved it. Partly because I just simply love this story. I'm not really going to revisit it a whole lot because the Zack Snyder movie exists, and I love that movie so much. And it doesn't have the appeal of the TV show where it's not actually based off of the comic book. No, this is a direct adaptation. If I want to see the legitimate adaptation of the book where you have the actual, octopus creature in it, as opposed to the Zack Snyder version, then I have this version that I can go to, and I appreciate that. But I think the main message and theme of the story still come across regardless which version you go with. And personally, when it comes to live action, I understand why Zack Snyder made the choice he did, and I support that choice, even though the original version is still great. And I think this, just it being a Watchmen movie, makes it up there as just my number 3 and number 4 for comic book movies of the year, just simply because it's a story that I love. They're really good. The animation presents some really good visuals that are taken out of the comics that I really appreciate. And overall, like I said, it's great. If you like Watchmen, you're going to like this. And I like Watchmen, so I like this. So that moves on to probably the most controversial opinion I'm going to have on this little episode here. Joker, Folie Deux. I thought this movie was great. And I'm not being sarcastic. I genuinely am one of the defenders of this movie. I was from the first moment I saw it. I loved this movie. It's a great exploration of identity, and just everyone's telling Arthur who he is. But he just needs to know who he is. He needs to figure out who he is. And this movie is about him figuring out who he is. Not what other people say he is, but who he is. And in terms of people getting mad at, this Joker, he's not the Joker. The first movie wasn't the origin story of the Joker, and this is blah, 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 blah. Yes, the first movie was still the origin story of the Joker, because the Joker was an idea. The Joker is the idea. Arthur Fleck was forced to embody the idea. So yes, Arthur Fleck was the Joker, but the Joker is not just Arthur Fleck, because the Joker is an idea. He's not one singular man. And this is sort of a movie about that, in my opinion. The Joker moved from Arthur Fleck to someone else. Because Arthur Fleck no longer needs to be the Joker. But that doesn't mean the Joker was never him. Because it was. It's not that he was the inspiration of it. No. It's the Joker is an idea. It's sort of this hypothetical mental illness that is sort of contagious, that you catch by killing the person that has it, or in a sort of way, and that's what happens here. And there's even versions in the comics where when you kill the Joker, whether it's a physical thing like you kill him and a laughing gas thing turns you into a new Joker, like there are versions of that in the comics as well, where if you kill the Joker, you become the Joker. So like, it's not even that inaccurate in terms of the comic books, in my opinion. It still has the same idea. It's still staying true to the character of the Joker. It's not some bullshit thing that a lot of people say, in my opinion. People are allowed to have their own opinions. One man's art is another man's shit, and vice versa. So if you hate this movie, I'm not going to say you're wrong. You're allowed to have your own opinion. But that means I'm allowed to have my own opinion as well. So just keep that in mind. And I just think it's brilliantly shot, obviously on a technical level. It's just brilliantly shot. And I just think there's so many things you can tackle with this movie and think about and just look over and analyze and just... It's a head-thinking movie. And I love head-thinking movies. You don't get a lot of that in comic book movies. And I appreciate that that's what this is. There's a lot of things here that I absolutely adore. And unlike what I was saying about like Venom the Last Dance, where there's like things in there that I'm not going to sit here and say it's perfect. This is a movie that I understand if you don't like it for some of the artsy stuff and like thematic stuff, but it's still a just really technically brilliantly made movie. And I understand not liking some of the thematic stuff. Okay, fine. I'm okay with that. But this movie gets so much hate that it baffles me that people would put this as like, call this like the worst comic book movie of the year. Especially in a year that has like Madam Web and The Crow and Kraven. Because yes, you can sit there and say, oh, I didn't like this thematic thing in it. But the movie itself is competently shot and edited and made and acted and just like it's just well done. It's good. And you might not have connected with it in the same way that the amount of hate I think this movie gets, it baffles me. That being said, here's one thing I will say. For as much as I love Joker Folie Deux, and as much as I might say on a technical level, if you separate comic book movie passion from this, just on a technical note, technical level, I might argue that it is the best movie out of all 12 of these of the year. That being said, it is not the comic book movie of the year. That belongs to Deadpool and Wolverine. Not by in my opinion, it's not a landslide because of what I just said. On a technical level, if you go into this as a cinephile who doesn't give two shits about comic book movies, and you just sit down and watch Joker Folie Deux, I think you're going to say it's a better movie than Deadpool and Wolverine. But I grew up watching 2000s comic book movies. Your Blades, your Ghost Riders, your Tim Story Fantastic Fours, your X-Men's. And you know what? Deadpool and Wolverine is a love letter to a lot of the movies I grew up with. And just a lot of the movies that made me into the movie fan that I am today. And for that reason, and that reason alone, and how well they do it, and the fact that they find a way to put emotion into it, and just everything about it, I genuinely, absolutely adored it. It is just great. I really don't have much to say beyond that. It is just this great love letter to the comic book movies that I grew up with. It's the best Deadpool movie. I've always been a fan of the first two Deadpool movies. I've been one of those weirdos that prefers the second one. But there's always something about them that always held it back from being up there with your Logans and your Days of Future Past for me. But this one gets up there for me. There's an aspect that I can see maybe holding it slightly back, It does kind of feel like an episode of Loki at times. But overall, like I said, it's just a brilliant love letter. I can't say that enough. Yeah, Elektra is a terrible movie. That Daredevil movie is a terrible movie. But seeing Jennifer Garner pop up as Elektra, absolutely love it. Loved it. Blade, obviously, Blade 2, one of my favorite Marvel movies. Seeing Wesley Snipes pop up, loved it. So, like, seeing Chris Evans' Human Torch pop up, loved it. It did get spoiled for me, though. But overall, like I said, I do think if you separate comic book movie fandom from it, I might argue that Folie Deux is a better movie. And a lot of people would disagree with me on that. That being said, I'm not separating my fandom, so that makes Deadpool and Wolverine the best of the year. I do think it's a lot closer for me than it is for everybody else. But it still comes away with being the best comic book picture of the year. Moving on to the horror side of things now. As you might be able to tell, this was filmed on a different day because I rang in the new year with a little flu, so I've been battling that a little bit, but so I just kind of had to take a little break there, but you don't want to hear about that, no. So let's talk about Nosferatu. I'm going to go into a little discussion here about the original Nosferatu film and the original Dracula film, because I got to say something. I am a major fan of the Todd Browning, Bela Lugosi film from 1931. I absolutely love that Dracula film. And, I don't have as big of a connection to the original Nosferatu with Max Schreck, but I've seen it, and I think on a grand epic scale, it provides a more epic feeling to the Dracula story as opposed to the Todd Browning film. But I like my performances, and that original Nosferatu, for technical reasons and just date or time period reasons, you didn't really have talkies yet, so that holds it back for me personally. I don't hold that against the film itself, but in terms of personal favoritism, it holds it back a little bit. Overall, I love the story of Dracula. I'm not a big fan of the Francis Ford Coppola one, even though he is one of my favorite directors. That's not one of his best films. And just overall, though, I still think, even after seeing this new film by Robert Eggers, who I love as a director, my favorite is still the 1931. I haven't seen the ones from the 70s, and I haven't seen the Christopher Lee one. But my favorite would still be that 1931 with Bela Lugosi. Let's get into the Robert Eggers film. I do not write reviews a whole lot on Letterboxd. I usually just keep it as general ratings and just collection of what I've seen, and collection of keeping track of rankings and stuff. I don't write a lot of reviews on there anymore. But I did write a review for this one because I initially gave it 4.5 stars or 4.5 slices, Poppa Jon system. And that's really good. That means I thought really well of this. I loved this movie. But I had to say one thing, and that's why I wrote a review. And simply put, I simply said, if it wasn't for the mustache, it could have been 5 stars. I am sorry. I don't know if anyone else picked up on that. I mean, I know a lot of people have said things about the mustache, but every single time that they would show a shot of him in Ellen's room, in this girl's room, every single time, it looked like Dr. Robotnik was just creepily in the shadows stalking this poor woman. In a weird way, that is creepy. In a weird way, that's probably even more creepy than Dracula or Count Orlok stalking you. Is Dr. Robotnik stalking you from the shadows? That's creepy. That's horrific for a horror movie. But yeah, that is my biggest complaint. It's not my only complaint. This is a movie that I think is going to go down a little bit the more I rewatch it, because I do think it is very well directed and well shot and well edited and just it's really well done. Robert Eggers is an amazing filmmaker. But there are a couple things here. I was a little disappointed when Thomas was going through and discovering the caskets and the coffins, and you don't get that iconic raising out of the coffin thing. It kind of feels like a cheap jump scare version of that you would get from rando studio vampire movie Dracula ripoff film, rather than a true filmmaker's artistic vision of it. And I did not like that. There are certain instances that I felt disappointed in something like that. That's the main one that I'm thinking of, where he discovers the coffins and he goes into the, the basement, not the basement, but, where all the coffins are. He undoes the thing, and, Count Orlok he kind of just very quickly jumps, and everything just scares and runs. And it's not like the whole raising out of the coffin like you would get in the original Nosferatu, or even the Bram Stoker's Dracula from the Coppola's Dracula. But overall, like I said, it's still a great movie. I have a couple nitpicks. Like, that's a small little nitpick of a scene that lasts a few seconds. The only real major gripe I have is the mustache. The mustache really, it feels very nitpicky to just harken on this mustache. I did not like this mustache, and I believe he has a mustache in the book. I only made it like 180 to 100 pages through the book, so I never really finished the book. I will someday. But even if he does have a mustache in the book, he doesn't have this mustache in the book. He doesn't have this gigantic mustache in the book. And if he does, okay, then that's an issue with the book. But I swear to God, he looked like when he's in the shadows, mainly, he looks like Dr. Robotnik. Now, when he's not necessarily in the shadows, it's not so much Dr. Robotnik look-ish. It's more of like very exaggerated porn stash Burt Reynolds. Like at the very end, when the sun comes up and he's sitting there, you have the blood. It looks like a parody of a porn stash dripping with blood. So I think they went way too overboard with the mustache. I don't mind him having a mustache, but why does it have to be that goddamn big? That's the part that makes no sense to me. Other than that, I like the design. I kind of like the whole design and big, imposing aspect of Count Orlok. I like that. Just the mustache. And the problem is, it's such a small little detail, but it's so exaggerated that it takes me out of the movie. It completely takes me out of the movie. But, I mean, other things. Let's move on from this mustache. I feel like I've been talking about this mustache for 8 minutes now. But, yeah. One thing I did really love was Lily Rose Depp here. And how her performance, it very much gives, like, exorcism, possession, horror vibes that I appreciated, and it added to the more unnerving side of everything here, and I really enjoyed that. I like how they included much more of the possession, exorcism type of thing in here. Really well shot. I said that multiple times already as well. You got the shot with the hand going over the city, which is really well done and iconic. But I think the shot that really, really got me back into this was the carriage shot. I was a huge fan of that. The carriage popping up and just the way Robert Eggers visualized that. Robert Eggers is amazing when it comes to cinematography. All of his movies have amazing cinematography. And I'm going to move on and just talk about Robert Eggers in general. Not all of his movies are horror movies, but they're all horror-ish adjacent, I would say, at least. So, I think among Robert Eggers' filmography, you have The Witch, which, when it originally came out, I appreciated it more than I loved it. I've grown to love it more over time. I still think it's his weakest of his four movies. That being said, it's still an amazing movie. If The Witch is your worst movie, then you are one hell of a damn good director. It is another one. Even though I do love it now, I still appreciate it more so than I love it. And then you have The Lighthouse, which we'll get into, but you also have The Northman and Nosferatu. And that's where I'm at right now, is those two are kind of neck and neck for me. We'll get into The Lighthouse, which I think is his best movie. We'll get into that. But between The Northman and Nosferatu, I think Nosferatu structurally is a better film. Because I think The Northman has some issues when it comes to the dream sequences and like the whole living tree stuff and how they visualize a lot of that. That kind of can take you out of it a little bit. Whereas Nosferatu, I think, is by far his most mainstream accessible movie, which helps it. But at the same time, I think one of the things that hurts it is that same thing. And I think with The Northman is one of those where I think streamline writing-wise, Nosferatu is better than The Northman. But personally, I prefer The Northman. Mainly just because I really dug a lot of the action set pieces and just the I like Alexander Skarsgård quite a bit. I'm a big Anya Taylor-Joy fan. And I just kind of love the whole Viking aesthetic and period piece that they were going for with The Northman so much. And they kind of have a King Arthur story there, even though it's more of a Hamlet, technically, with how they find the dagger and everything, or the sword. So I really dug The Northman more than Nosferatu, personally. I think they're neck and neck. They're basically the same rating. And I think Nosferatu is probably better if you're looking more just mathematical, technical sense. But I do prefer The Northman. That being said, Robert Eggers' masterpiece is still The Lighthouse, in my opinion. I was very late to the party on The Lighthouse because, like I said, The Witch, I appreciated more than I enjoyed. And the trailers for The Lighthouse, I was like, I'm not, I don't want, it looks a little too pretentious. And I love pretentious shit, but it was like, I'll check it out at some point. And I didn't even check it out until a few years later. But when I did, I fucking loved it so much. The Lighthouse is a goddamn masterpiece. I understand why some people don't like it, and I'm not going to disagree with you on that. I understand why people would say Nosferatu is his best movie, or they like The Northman more. Whatever. Like I said, I think Nosferatu is his most mainstream, accessible movie, and I think that's going to be why a lot of people will have Nosferatu as their favorite of the Eggers films. But for me, it's going to be The Lighthouse. I think it's one of the best films in recent years. I absolutely love it. Love it, love it, love it. But just sticking to horror here with Nosferatu. I don't have a whole lot more to say. It really just does come down to that mustache is a bigger problem for me than I think it should be. And I think that there is an issue. It's such a small detail that becomes a big issue because it just completely takes me out of it. It's like you have this great, great movie, amazing movie, feel tense and sort of not necessarily scary, but on edge and thrilled. And in this period piece world, and you're just there engrossed in it, and then all of a sudden it cuts to Dr. Robotnik standing in the shadows. But everything else is so good. It's so good. It's the other thing that does hold it back, I guess, is just that if I'm going to watch a Dracula story, I'm sorry, I'm going to watch the Todd Browning film with Bela Lugosi. I love the Bela Lugosi performance. I love Van Helsing performance in that movie. I love the Renfield performance. I still will always revisit the Todd Browning film over this. And I might be alone. I'm pretty sure I'm not alone in that because that film has a lot of followers. But that is my personal take. And, my favorite vampire film is probably that original Dracula film. So, still is. It's nothing against Robert Eggers' film. It's still great. Still one of the best of the year. Just that damn mustache. All right. Hopefully you enjoyed this first episode of Heroes in Horror. It is a little delayed compared to my original plan because, like I said, I rang in the new year with a flu. I rang in the new year with a high fever, and it's taken a little longer than expected to get rid of it. So here we are. That being said, my January's, I got some plans. hopefully next week I should be able to talk about 2025 and just my most anticipated of the year for both comic book movies and horror movies. There's a lot in 2025 that I'm excited for. You got Superman, obviously, the Fantastic Four, and then on the horror side of things, the Wolfman. I'm so excited for Wolfman, and that is coming out very soon. Plus, one of my favorite franchises is finally returning with Final Destination Bloodlines. So we'll get into a lot of that shit. So keep that all in mind. So hopefully you can check out next week if you are interested in this video. So that being said, remember that one man's art is another man's shit and vice versa. So respect people's opinions because one man's art's another man's shit.